It's great to be back to share in this New Look conference, and I want to congratulate Judith for her initiatives in doing that. We know these are challenging times, and there's been this assault on quality public education, and we've stood up to that, and we're proud of what we've achieved. We've led the defence of quality public education in this country, and we've made some progress. We just have to look at the thousands we turned out on the streets back in April. That was the biggest demonstration on the streets against this government in its term, and NZEI did and led that. Take a bow to yourselves. We've turned out thousands into our meetings around the teachers' agreements, and we will continue to do that. But I think everyone in this room knows that's not enough, and we're just going to have to do more, and I'm going to cover a lot of that stuff in the course of my speech. But first of all, I'm just going to reflect on some of the politics of what's going on in this country at the moment. For the last 6 months, I've argued that at a national level, the phone is off the hook to the National Party. But the problem is, it was even more off the hook to Labor and the centre-left. Voters have stopped listening to the National Party, but they've not been convinced by the opposition. So that's why the Nats polling has continued to be high, because it's a Conservative reaction. We'll just stay with the lot we've got because we don't think that we're convinced about the other lot. They think, well, I think that voting support for the National, for the centre-right, is fragile, and it's based solely around a formidable politician, and that's not Hekia Parata, that's John Key. The Labor leadership selection process seems to have maybe started to switch that. For the first time, Labor dominated the political news, with good news, a sense of unity and solidarity, and some decent left-wing policy. It demonstrated leadership, unity, and good ideas. And interestingly enough, the openness of that process seemed to engage most New Zealanders. Not just Labor Party members, but when you see this stuff on TV every night, you start to own the result. And I think that's flowing through into the good polling that's happened since that time, because most New Zealanders have had an unparalleled opportunity to evaluate the leadership of the Labor Party, and they've come up reasonably good. So the polls have reflected that, but I don't think NZEI Te Riu Roa can afford to go into the next year with anything other than a belief that the centre-right will win that election at the end of next year, and we've got another 3 years of this fight to go on with. We cannot afford to convince ourselves otherwise. And remember, our strategy is around shifting the politics from germ to our view of quality public education. We have to make education a vote shifter. So those policies those guys were talking about resonate with the electorate, and they decide to vote for that on that basis. So how are we going? First of all, you heard the panel. I think we're making progress with the parties of the centre-left. But let's look at the other side, the centre-right. They desperately wanted education to be their story. In my view, that's gone for them. Now they just want education out of the headlines. It's a major negative for the centre-right and for the National Party. They've had a series of major backdowns, and I'm proud to say we've led a lot of those. Hekia Parata has been told to only speak about rigorously good news stories. They've suffered damage, political damage, around a series of one-off events, Nova Pay obviously, the failures of the ministry, Christchurch, etc. So I suspect their polling's telling them that they're not making progress on education, so let's kill it, let's neutralise it. And what that does, if you think strategically, that leaves an enormous vacuum for us and parties that believe in our values to exploit. To fill that with assertive and innovative policy that rebuilds our quality public education system and rebuilds the sector's confidence in government. Because that issue of confidence is a really critical issue. Whatever the government is, they need the confidence of the education sector, and that is absolutely not there. Whatever process this government has set up, that forum that Judith talked about yesterday, right through to all the other bogus forms of consultation, they will not work because the profession has lost confidence in this government. And any new government of whatever hue will not make progress until that confidence is restored, and it won't be restored until there is a respect for the profession and for their unions that are the voice of that profession. And you just think about it, it's so bad now that when government says one thing, the profession believe exactly the opposite. So we have a minister who on one hand says, and I quote from the video, "Our education system is indeed world class." And then on the other hand says, in a press release, "New Zealand's education system is performing less and less well next to other OECD countries. We must increase our system performance and increase the equity in our system as benefits students." Which Hekia do we believe? I know which Hekia the sector believes. And the gall of any national government cabinet minister to talk about equity when they have presided over this country turning into one of the worst income disparity countries in the OECD. We are 28th out of 31. In fact, over the period of the mid-1980s to the mid-2000s, we in Sweden have recorded the strongest growth in income disparity. And she talks about equity in the system. We know, and you know, that 200,000 kids living in poverty, and the issue for this government is how much do we give the next America's Cup bid? Shame! This government totally ignores what every person in this room knows, that the largest variations in student learning are attributable to what students bring to the classroom. Ability, attitude, background, all the issues of the socio-economic issues. And how often do they talk about that? So let's move on to the year past. And I'll just be brief here because we don't want to wallow in the past too much. But just remember how bad they are. I'll just run through it. Charter schools. And never ever call them partnership schools. That's their language. Our language is charters. Public money, private profit. Performance-based pay. Unqualified teachers. More national standards. League tables. Packed. More cuts in ECE. The absolute mess of Christchurch. Let's not forget that. That pain and suffering still going on. The Teachers' Council review, where she says you create an independent Teachers' Council by her appointing all the governance structures. The mess of special education, which has not had the attention it deserves. A Ministry of Education that's turned into a compliance machine. The reintegration of Wanganui Collegiate along with a $3 million sweetener. And even the abolition of the school journal. Just how bad can they be? And we responded, not randomly, we responded in a directed and focused way, in a planned fashion, and that is the hallmark of NZEI Te Riu Roa. We saw the video, we know what our members can do, what they're capable of. We have to direct and focus that anger, that frustration, that upset, in order to turn these sorts of policies over, and the people that who follow them turn them over as well. We know that the public are behind us. Those meetings, the last round of teacher meetings for the bargaining, occurred in contact time. Not one editorial or negative article in the media occurred at that time. Amazing, if you think about it. And that's simply because the public are on your side. They believe in what we're saying and they don't believe in what that other lot is saying. So we have to carry that momentum into 2014 and on through 2014. Next year we've got an attack on two fronts. Firstly, on our ongoing stance on quality public education, on our rights under the Employment Relations Act, because we haven't talked about the Employment Relations Act and the attack on workers' rights so far at this conference, and I just want to mention that. Be absolutely clear, those changes to the Employment Relations Act are directed at the teacher unions. We have heard that at the highest level. But they're also directed at the most vulnerable in this economy, because apparently they're all out there earning too much. The removal of the 30-day rule, where new employees are automatically covered by site collective agreements, that will play heavily against support staff starting jobs in schools that are strapped for cash and seeking to balance their budget. The ability of the employer to conclude bargaining by application to the Employment Relations Authority and remove any rights the union has to industrial action. That is a direct attack on our right to organise and collectively bargain. Go back to the PTCA, think about that power in the hands of Hekia Parata. The continuing undermining of collective bargaining by attacking multi-employer agreements is unjustified and unnecessary, as the government's own Labor Department pointed out. And of course, the removal of tea breaks. What is it about working people that this government hates? And correspondingly, what is it about Warner Brothers, Sky City, South Canterbury Finance, Rio Tinto, and all the other mates of John Key and Bill English that attracts them so much? Millions and millions and millions of dollars poured off to corporate mates. They can't even keep the workshops in Dunedin open. The sector's starved for money. Rio Tinto get a $30 million handout. What's wrong with the values in this country? And we must join with the Council of Trade Unions and working people throughout New Zealand in opposing these changes. And while I'm on that, I just want to say something about support staff. We all know about the plight of support staff in this country. I'm not going to go back through that. We can share all, we know that. And if you're in any doubt, just look at Nova Pay and how support staff took the brunt of that, and I congratulate them for that. So let's applaud them for that. That situation for support staff is untenable, but it's untenable that a critical part of our education system is built on a foundation of low pay, shocking employment practice, and no professional recognition. 4 years ago, we broke the wage freeze and lifted those rates off the minimum wages. It's now time to return to the battleground for support staff. This time we need to be more sophisticated, more joined up in what we do, linking the issues of support staff through to our building blocks towards a properly remunerated workforce. This campaign is political, but it is also industrial and professional. There are 3 objectives in this campaign. Think a triangle. One apex has it is about career pathways, whereby support staff have the same opportunities that teachers do to move through career pathways into specialisations that are recognised through proper qualifications and proper professional development, not the dodgy stuff that goes on out there now. Qualifications and professional development that are recognised across the schooling system and are properly remunerated. The second point on the triangle is about funding. We have to move, as we heard today, the funding away from the handout mentality, the OPS grant, to a central funding regime. The third point on the triangle is every school needs to be a living wage school. Establishing a floor for wages. We cannot address the issue of wages until we raise the floor, and that means the schools have to be funded to do that, and the way we get political space to fund them is we show we have got a vision for a professional part of the school workforce called support staff, which will enhance teaching and learning in New Zealand. So it's time we started doing that, and we're starting that with support staff bargaining. It's a whole of union campaign. We will be back on the streets, absolutely, around this. Prepare for the latter part of term 1, I'd suggest. We'll be back in MP offices and in our communities. We have to right this wrong, we have to right it permanently. Everyone in this room believes that, and we've all got to go out and lead that. The second part of 2014 is about the attack on quality public education. We have a series of events planned for next year. The summit we've heard about. We've got the primary conference in January. We've got the support staff campaign. We're going to take this lot on through the course of the year. We have to convince people to switch their vote around education before the election campaign is announced, because once the campaign's announced, you get squeezed out. We have to shift those votes right through that period up to July, August. But there are two issues I really want to bring to you and just leave with you. First of all, school funding. You've probably seen all this news about school funding, the claims from the Minister that decile funding is clumsy. The PBDA have set out their views. The Minister set up a project group on funding. What does this mean? What does it mean? Do we hear overtones of Treasury's work, which we discovered through the Official Information Act, where they talked of funding being tied to NZEI and national standards results? And remember the Treasury speak when they talk of the total resourcing model? That's the new language for bulk funding. I think this government is manoeuvring to return to bulk funding, and if they can, some form of voucher system, and I think they're going to back that in through iwi. We've got a major battle on our hands again around school funding, and just when you thought it was bad enough, with every other bit that's been rolled up, we've got another battleground coming at us. The only question here is timing. Do they do it before the election or bring it through in their manifesto and do it after the election? It's bad policy, bad for an education system, and it's bad for kids learning, and we will oppose that just as we did in the 90s, and we will beat it back as we did in the 90s. Now, the second matter is a bit more complicated and it's a bit more intriguing, and there's upside and downside opportunities and risks for us in this. So we're going to have to approach it carefully. And so just bear with me on this. And it's just some initial thinking. I think we're in a time of historical change in New Zealand's education system. I think there is a systemic shift in education underway that's not linked to party politics, but to a number of other forces within the system leading to system change. And by this I mean the following. I believe the high water mark of tomorrow's schools has been reached. There is a system shift underway to a new form of schools, and I call it a shift from schools to schooling. There is a tectonic shift, and coming from Wellington, as the Christchurch people know, that's a pretty big issue for us. There is a tectonic shift in education underway. And simply put, the contradictions inherent in the Tomorrow Schools model are such that those contradictory forces are stronger than the forces for Tomorrow Schools model. So individual schools operating more or less on their own cannot deliver what the system needs. What the system needs can mainly and only be delivered across schools, hence schooling. The new model of schooling will have the individual school at its base, but it's not driven by what that individual school needs, but what the system needs. The school will begin increasingly to reflect what the system needs, not the other way around. Now, this is not a party political change. You're not hearing that lot talk about it or that lot talk about it. In my view, it's a change driven by those contradictions within tomorrow's schools. But it is intensely political. And it's political about where it lands, where it finishes up. What is going to be the shape of new schooling? That's where the new battleground in education is going to be. And what evidence do I have for this? Absolutely circumstantial and anecdotal. All right? So I'm doing everything that we criticise the other lot for. Firstly, I think schools recognise this themselves with the move to increase clustering. This is an informal or an informal recognition that education requires a high level of sharing and collaborative practice to make it work. And that's now being formally recognised in all sorts of ways. But in my view, it goes beyond physical clusters. And I think we're going to see increasing use of virtual clusters and groupings and other shapes for other purposes. Likewise, the question is, that schooling model going to be merely horizontal, for example, just across primary, or are there going to be vertical elements, ECE, primary, secondary, maybe into those transitions? Secondly, Kathy Wiley's analysis in Vital Connections of the book is spot on here. Whether she's captured the change and just describing it or leading it is not really relevant, but it's a very useful piece of work in this debate, and I'll commend it to you. But it's interesting about Kathy's work is her analysis is not controversial, but her solutions are controversial. And that feeds back to my argument about the politics of where this is going to land. Thirdly, we see it taking shape in other matters. For example, in our recently settled primary principals collective agreement, the highest graded principal is required to show evidence they work across a learning or professional community, engage in a wide range of educational networks across the sector. So in fact, we're incentivising principals to actually break out of their schools and work in a schooling collaborative basis. Likewise for teachers, is there any reason in principle why the ASET teacher should be confined to his or her school? There isn't any reason in principle for that. Why not across a range of schools? And take support staff, the same argument applies there. And if you look at the regional Nova Pay administrators, that's exactly what they're doing. They're working across a range of schools, and these people are saying we should be remunerated for it. Absolutely yes. But the system's not designed to cope with that yet. But the system is changing, and we have to get in front of it. Fourthly, Christchurch. We've often said Christchurch is the test bed for education reform in this country, the government's view of it anyway. Is the supersised Aranui school a sign of where the government wants this to fall out? Maybe that's a vertical response to the pressures for change as against a horizontal cluster-based approach. Fifthly, and this is a real watch this space, the soon-to-be-announced school governance review, which dropped out of that dreadful coalition deal the Nats and ACT put together. Charter schools is one part, this is the other part. Will that be dealing with new forms of governance for new arrangements of schools? For example, one board across a range of schools. See, if I'm right on this, or even faintly right, all sorts of issues start to come up, and a big issue is leadership. What does being a principal look like in this new schooling system? Does it enhance their opportunities to be a professional learning leader because things like property and HR, etc., drop off and go somewhere else? And that's what's being talked about by the ministry and the government at the moment. So maybe there is something more to those proposals to voluntarily outsource property matters and HR matters. There are more questions than answers in this. And it's interesting, this is really interesting to me anyway, that when some OECD research claims that devolved school systems in relatively affluent countries work better than centralised school systems, in one of the most devolved school systems in the world, which is ours, we're actually starting to maybe go back the other way. And one of the foci of the teaching summit is around devolution, and people are coming to look to New Zealand to look at our devolved system, and maybe we're actually going back the other way. But to where? To where? Where is it going to fall? And that is the question. And the difficult part is, what will that model be? Will it be a competitive schooling system driven by scale efficiencies? a system where equity of access to education plays second fiddle to school arrangements driven by competition and eventually privatisation? Or are we about a system that enhances collaboration and produces equity, allows for equity and creates equity and outcomes? How do we ensure that a new system retains the strong side points, the upside of tomorrow's schools? How do we ensure there's still a substantial sense and practice of community ownership? Is evidence going to drive the debate or ideology? Our position is clear. The answer should be found through a debate driven by evidence and principle, both things strongly lacking in this government. And if you want to know what that principle looks like for NZEI, Te Riu Roa, look at the antidote to the germ. But the point I'm making is we can't sit passively by and let the system change without entering the debate, not just entering the debate, getting ahead of it and shaping where it does land. I don't know the answers to those questions, but we have to start to talk about it. Because if that systemic change is underway, we're probably a bit late. So, in conclusion, I hope I've left you with plenty to think about that supplements the more direct learning and experiences you're gaining from this conference. Yes, we are in invigorating times. We're in a struggle where quality public education is under the strongest and most sophisticated attack, I'd suggest, ever in this country now. It surpasses the 1990s. It's bigger and uglier and hairier. We've won some battles, and there's plenty more to be won, but my sense is we do have the public on side. They're worried about their education system, and they have every reason to be worried about the way this government has behaved. Our trick, your trick, all of our tricks, is how do we convert that worry to action and convert that action to voting. That's the challenge for all of us in our schools, our centres, our offices, and everywhere else we are throughout Aotearoa, New Zealand. We've made a good start. Let's go on and finish the job. Let's stand up for quality public education, because I tell you what, we don't want a side of that other lot. Thank you very much.